there. And if you're at home in your jammies, more power to you. Tonight's program takes place in Musquamscook, now called Exeter, in Nadakina, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the Alnabak, the people who stewarded Nadakina and its Aki, Nibi, Alaquakak, and Owaasak, the land, the waterways, flora, and fauna throughout the generations. We're coming to you tonight from the Exeter Town Hall, and I'm going to turn it over now to Laura Martin.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm Laura Martin, the other co-executive director of the Exeter Historical Society, and I welcome you tonight. I'm glad that you're here in person or virtually to learn all about milk trains. I'd like to make a few quick announcements. First, I want to thank Exeter TV for bringing all of our programs to you virtually and allowing us to reach a much larger audience than we would be otherwise. So they have been wonderful partners, and we thank them. Please check out our Facebook page and our website for future programs and events. And for our February program, Barbara, who you just saw, will explore the legends and lore of Exeter's history. So you won't want to miss that. That will be here at the Town Hall at 7 p.m. And naturally, I didn't write what day it was, but it's the first Tuesday of February. Tonight, if you'd like to ask a question and you're here in person, please raise your hand and wait for one of us to come to you with a microphone. Not only will it help our speaker hear you, but it will also help those who are online hear you. And that way, our speaker's answers will make more sense. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. Dave Saums is a lifelong railroad buff and photographer, a member of Seacoast Art Association in Exeter, and has lived in Amesbury for over 20 years. Also, he's fond of short introductions, which is okay with me. Welcome back, Dave.
Ready for coming? I feel like a penguin. I've got so many clothes on. I walk funny, like a penguin. Okay. Can everyone hear me? Thanks for coming. I want to say to begin, this is not just a presentation with railroad photographs. This is a presentation about milk, really, and what happened with the development in a number of industries that led to a very significant improvement in health, especially in urban areas, based on the availability of fresh milk. So that's really what this is all about. Milk cars and milk trains on the railroads were a key ingredient, but there were a couple of other key ingredients required first. Yeah, is it on actually? Oh, it is. All right, good. Okay, just to start for fun, this was an ad series that I'm sure many people will recognize. This was an ad campaign that really, really hit home. It was developed in 1993 for the California Milk Processor Board. It spawned a number of spin-offs, and you may remember all the mustaches and other such advertising. I'm told that I don't show enough photographs of railroads right up front. So here's a photograph of a railroad train. Keep everybody happy from the get-go. This is the Rutland Railroad. This is in Burlington, Vermont, and this is from Jim Dufour's collection. A lot of us that are lifelong railroad buffs tend to have a lot of photographs, a lot of negatives and such. The photographer was Robert Collins, a well-known railroad photographer. Oh, and the point of showing it is, if you look carefully here, you'd be able to see all of these cars are milk cars, with one exception, which is the combine, the passenger car at the very end. and often a combine was used on the Rutland in place of a caboose on the milk trains. Okay, so generally speaking, what do I want to talk about here? As cities were growing and growing rapidly, a lot of what I show will be based on what happened in New York City because there's so much data and information available about New York City, especially coming from Columbia University and from a very interesting booklet that was published pressing for changes in government regulation of milk and how milk was produced and delivered to cities. Generally speaking, the United Kingdom was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. The development of the steam engine for stationary power meant that significant changes could take place in where mills were located. Instead of being located wherever there were fast-moving rivers and dams, mills could now be put in urban areas with steam power providing a replacement for what had been water power. That meant even more development of urban areas. So more mills with steam power meant more rapid population growth, and not just in the UK, but then also in the United States. Crowding in cities, oh, Bob, we love hearing those Downeasters, don't we? Crowding in cities became much more challenging by the 1840s, especially for the less well-to-do. The health of newborn babies, of infants, was an increasingly serious issue. No electricity, no refrigeration, not invented yet, no grocery stores with any way to provide cooling for milk, fresh milk, in any significant way. Stables were found next to almost every building, but those were generally stables for horses because it was the horse-drawn era. Some families were able to keep a cow in an urban property, but if you lived on the 4th floor of a tenement building, you didn't have a choice there. You didn't have a cow. So what did people do for milk? In 1840, New York City children were fed what was called loose milk. It was also known by a very derogatory name, swill milk. And swill milk became the source of what became the swill milk scandal. Swill milk was priced at 4 cents per quart at the time. It came from city cows that were fed on things you don't necessarily want to know about. This was not at all a healthy situation. Half of New York City children died before reaching the age of 5. That's how significant this problem was. By 1841, the population of Manhattan had grown to 300,000 people. That sounds like a drop in the bucket today compared to 8.5 million, but consider how different things were then in what I'm describing here. Thomas Decker, in 1841, came up with the bright idea of developing a regular milk delivery service with his horse and wagon from his country farm in Harlem. He was also the founder of what later became Sheffield Farms. Country milk is what it was called, and it was priced at 15 cents per quart. Remember what I said earlier, swill milk was 4 cents per quart. Significant difference in price. The well-to-do could afford the so-called country milk. The first delivery from upstate New York of country milk, 1841, a chemistry professor at Columbia University began investigating urban diseases, including food sources. This was the beginning of serious investigation of what was happening with health challenges in the city of New York. Again, I said I would talk largely using data from New York City, but the same things were occurring in Boston and other major cities. New York City simply was a very large city by comparison and had a very, very significant and rapidly changing challenge. By 1880, all New York City milk was arriving by railroad. Very significant change. What allowed all that to happen? A couple of more dates here. Some of these things will seem a little out of sequence, but in 1893, Sheffield Farms opened the very first pasteurization plant for milk in the United States. 1907, President Roosevelt authored a panel which then declared pasteurization to work effectively to prevent much sickness and save lives. 1908, the New York Milk Committee, a private operation, not a government operation, was providing milk stations, as they were called, for infants around the city. By 1910, the International Pure Milk League was founded, another not-for-profit organization, And between 1910 and 1912, New York City became the first major city to require mandatory fluid milk pasteurization. That was a very significant step. By 1922, just 10 years later, in New York City, dramatic improvements, and I've listed some data here. 450,000 cows on farms delivering milk to New York City. Now, the cows weren't doing the delivery, of course, but the number of railroads bringing milk to New York City, 11. The shortest run for a milk car, 44 miles. The longest railroad haul, 450, actually 467 miles, and I'll show you a map of that, that route. The number of pasteurizing plants in the city was up to 39. The number of milk distributing locations was 343. The number of wagons required to deliver milk within the city of New York, 5,500 wagons delivering milk every day. Why so many? How many buildings were there? What was the population? And clearly, the number of workers required was going to be very significant. The estimate, this all comes from Columbia University, the estimate was there were 250,000 people involved in the milk industry by this time, 1922. The number of gallons of milk delivered, 210 million in New York City. What took changes to occur? Ice harvesting. Ice harvesting became a commercial business. Way back in Boston in 1806, a man named Frederick Tudor, who is known as the Ice King, loaded a ship with 1,500 tons of ice that was harvested from a particular pond, and he shipped it to the Bahamas. This was credited as being the first commercial business to sell ice in the United States in bulk. He was in the Bahamas and he couldn't get ice cream. 1831, three men got together and started selling blocks of ice as a commercial business in New York City. They cut the ice from a specific lake in Conyers, New York, and Valley Cottage across the Hudson River, and that was Rutland Lake. They formed a company that they named the Knickerbocker Ice Company. The company eventually owned dozens of steamboats operating on the Hudson River, dozens of barges for hauling ice across the river to Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens, and employed 3,000 workers. Ice harvesting became a big business, and harvesting, storage, and transportation was quite labor-intensive. Ice houses, as they were called, were built at Rutland Lake, that first lake that Frederick Tudor had started with, and then other lakes as well, and ponds for storage for ice. All of that having to be built in such a way and insulated that it would survive into and through the summer. The Knickerbocker Ice Company became big business. It had locations for ice houses at these particular streets within Manhattan. The availability of ice boxes, ice for purchase, eventually spread to every street. It meant wider availability of milk, cheese, butter, dairy products for the population. New York City consumed 285,000 tons of ice in 1880 and 5 million tons by 1895. The United States, in total, 25 million tons of ice per year by the end of the 1800s. Ice preservation meant, of course, more than just dairy products, but meats also, and that proved to be far more effective than salting or canning. Ice houses made storage of ice possible throughout the year. Farmhouses traditionally had always had a dark basement area that was used as the vegetable cellar, but was also cool enough for storing foodstuffs that were subject to spoilage, but city dwellers didn't have those opportunities. Thomas Jefferson had an ice house on his property in Virginia. He had one built during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. I thought that was rather humorous. Ice houses became quite common once this commercial ice harvesting business really got going after 1800. And in Europe, the same thing was happening. And in fact, Norway became by far the dominant, it says ice exporting company. Obviously, that's wrong, but Norway became the champion ice exporting country. Ice houses were built typically on ponds and rivers, lakes that were known for clean, clear water. And this was, even though it spread worldwide as an idea in northern climates, it was for some reason seen as very typical of New York and New England. Here are some of the other businesses that developed in handling ice and ice harvesting. So you might recognize some of the names of some of the companies like Bird and Son for insulation materials. We still have Bird supplying insulation materials. I don't think the cold storage ice and trade journal is still published today, however. Here are some photographs. You can see the magnitude of some of these operations. This is on the St. Lawrence River in upstate New York. And this is an ice house on the right. And we're out on the river, and the operation involves eventually power saws to saw the ice, and the horses and the wagons that you see and the sleds that you see is to haul ice. There would also be, for a large ice house, there would also be an elevator built. It doesn't show that well in this photograph, but behind where the men are standing up on the platform is the ice elevator for this particular ice house. Here's an example of a power saw being used to cut ice. This is from Wisconsin. Here's another example of harvesting, this on the Hudson River. With developments like this, the development of the commercial ice industry, the ability to store ice, then also some other changes were occurring with farming, especially dairy farming. A typical dairy farm, Keene, New Hampshire. One of the changes taking place, and this is going to jump ahead a little bit in time though, there had become many calls for government regulation of especially milk and dairy products. And so in this case, this is an inspection report from the city of for the city of Boston for a farmer in Vermont. He only had 8 cows, and yet, this is 1937, this particular report, and yet his farm was subject to inspection by the city of Boston, by an inspector. Pasteurization was something that was relatively new at the turn of the century, and it was John D. Rockefeller in particular from Standard Oil who drove the demand for what became government regulation with pasteurization. So Rockefeller and his Rockefeller Foundation pushed very hard for government regulation. New York State established the 3 grades of milk, A, B, and C. What's called raw milk was always viewed as having higher value. The swill milk was the problem and the source of the demand for regulation of the dairy industry. 30,000 farms in 6 states and Canada were supplying milk to New York City in 1918. 75% came from New York State farms, as an example of how significant the transportation of milk had become. And we'll get to the transportation part in a minute. By 1916, a major milk producers strike occurred. The selling price by that time for milk, for grade B milk, was up to 9 cents per quart, but did not cover the costs of production. And because of the strike, eventually the price of milk had risen to 15 cents per quart. The arguments continued for government regulation. That led to the development of these kinds of inspection reports and the need for inspectors. Pasteurization was established as a requirement in New York City as the first place in 1910. New York State, all of New York State, 1911, and across the United States by 1912. I mentioned that this was an effort driven largely by John D. Rockefeller. He gets a great deal of credit for the establishment of pasteurization as a legal requirement. This also meant another new industry. New York State, for example, the Department of Agriculture had 7,000 inspections of farms and dairy plants by this past year, 2024, with 4,000 inspections of dairy farms. In other words, a lot of inspectors were involved in being able to meet these requirements. Now, just some quick images for milk delivery. This is the standard 40-quart milk can on the left. That was the standard method of hauling milk, either on a farmer's wagon or by railroad. The milk cans would be tagged with a label so that it was clear where they were going to. Many cans also had the owner's name, in this case H.B. Hood in the top photograph, Boston Dairy Company in the lower photograph, copper plates that were soldered onto the cans so the cans would get returned to their owner. This is an example of a creamery on the right, and this is a postcard, hand-colored postcard from Germany. This happens to be from the town I grew up in. The building on the right is the creamery. That was a Dairyman's League creamery and had been a Sheffield Farms creamery before that. And there are a couple of MDT milk reefers on the siding by the creamery. The railroad is gone today, but the creamery building is still there. It's been converted to apartments. This is a view of that same small town that I grew up in. And let's see if I can use the pointer. The creamery is here. This is what was called the milk pond, and each creamery typically would have either a lake or a pond, which was a source of ice. This is the elevator to carry blocks of ice from the pond in the wintertime up to the ice house that's connected to the dairy. This was the railroad station. This was the feed and grain dealer here, and our house was right over here. There are some examples here of small town creameries. This is in Copake, New York, about 5 miles from the town I just showed you. There were many creameries and dairy milk processing plants around the country. This is a list I put together of just some of the creameries here in New Hampshire. I suspect you probably can't read that, unfortunately, from where you are, but lots of dairies, lots of creameries. Some of them you may recognize, if you could read this, you might recognize some of the names because some of those names still exist for other reasons, turning into ice cream suppliers and that sort of thing. This is a similar list of Massachusetts creameries. Sorry for the small type. I'm guessing you can't read that. Some other examples of creameries. This one's a brick creamery built by the Bennington County Cooperative Creamery in Manchester, Vermont, 1922. This is a fairly large small town creamery in Hobart, New York. This is a Sheffield Farms creamery. The ice house, I believe, This, I believe, is the ice house for this particular creamery. This is a brick creamery, and the photograph is labeled as being Bedford, Massachusetts. I think it's actually New Bedford. That would make better sense, especially with the name Old Colony Creamery. This was the Baker's River Creamery Company, a very small creamery. This is in West Rumney, New Hampshire. And this is the creamery that you see in the photograph here. New Boston Creamery in New Boston, New Hampshire. Just a couple of examples of how industrialized milk production became in some of the larger creameries and dairy processing plants. There are many, many photographs available from the Library of Congress. I didn't try to include many of them, just 2 here. This came from post-Great Depression era photography, photographers hired by the Works Progress Administration and other government agencies. So there are many, many photographs of many different subjects, but it strikes me as how many are of creameries and milk processing plants. I want to include this just as an example of how significant the industrialization of milk production became. This was a major new Sheffield Farms milk plant that was built in the Bronx, 1075 Webster Avenue. That building still exists, and I am suspecting that it is, although it was abandoned, I'm suspecting it's been taken over by Columbia University and repurposed. That is, without the huge milk bottle on the roof. Okay, examples of how milk and cream were delivered. Many of you may recognize these. There is a Creamery bottle on the left, sour cream. There is a 1-quart milk bottle in the center. How many of us had milk delivered at our parents' house in a milk box like that? Okay, most people today probably don't know what those are. Yale Borden Jr. was a very inventive man who tried and failed at a number of different efforts at invention. But he finally succeeded in developing the first condensed milk manufacturing plant that was successful. He built one in Connecticut in Walcottville, failed. Built one in Burrville, Connecticut, failed, financial panic of 1857. He partnered up with a very well-to-do man who became his investor, and he finally was able to construct a factory in Wassaic, New York, which became the very first successful condensed milk factory in the country or in the world. And that proved just a few years later during the Civil War to be a very significant facet for Union Army troops, because condensed milk, which did not require ice or refrigeration, could still be carried by the troops. Now, we get to the railroad part. An explosion of railroad construction occurred across the country. I just love this photograph. This is Belknap Point in the town of Alton, New Hampshire, and that little station over there still exists today. It's got a bigger station, It's got a bigger station attached to it, built right next to it and attached to it, but it still exists today. And this is a so-called American, that's the term used for a 440 steam locomotive, which is what this is. And this is on a predecessor for what became the Boston Main Railroad. And I suspect the photographer is standing out on the lake in order to take this photograph. And it's clearly a posed photograph because the train is stationary. The crew is standing looking out. The railroad refrigerator car was a major development. This was the method by which fresh fruits, vegetables, dairy products, meats could be handled by railroad across the country. Typically, a refrigerator car, known as a reefer, had hatches in the roof where blocks of ice, very large blocks of ice, were dropped in, one in each corner, so 4 hatches on the roof, and then sawdust or hay or straw was used, or combinations, as insulation on top of and around whatever was being carried. The railroad milk car is a different animal. The milk car is known either as a can car or as a tank car, milk tank car. And the distinction is the early cars were all designed to carry the standard 40-quart milk cans, and they could carry a couple of hundred of them. They would be stacked typically 2 layers high, and there would be, again, sawdust, straw, or hay packed in around, and ice on top. There were no hatches typically on a milk car because it was too cumbersome to try and load in the milk cans and then place these very large blocks of ice. If you consider that milk pickups were made at each railroad station, typically on a line, and railroad stations were frequently built only 4 miles apart, roughly. 4 miles was generally the maximum, well, 2 miles actually, was the maximum distance a farmer would be willing to take his team and his wagon to carry milk to the station for delivery to the railroad, for pickup by the railroad. Tank cars are shown in these 2 photographs. These are both steel tank cars. The first ones were built in 1922, and each end, there's one large tank here, one large tank here. So typically these cars had these 2 very large tanks, and they were not set up to handle canned milk. So these essentially replaced the canned milk carriage. And yes, if you can read what this one says, it is indeed a baker's chocolate car. So this is liquid chocolate. It's not actually milk. The lower photograph is a Fodler car for lease to Sheffield Farms. Interestingly, also, much later, there was wine carried in these cars, and that was the Chateau Martin company that did that, not for very long. Here are some examples. These are models, HO scale models. These are in my collection. These came from Lou Sassy, who has moved to North Carolina. A wonderful, wonderful modeler, and Lou built the diorama that he used to take these photographs with. So this is a wood milk tank car. So again, even though it's built of wood and not steel, it has the two large tanks for carrying bulk fluid milk. This is a later iteration of a milk tank car. This was typically Borden's, but there were a couple of other companies that had these also. You can see very rather Art Deco design. This is what's referred to as the fin, and these were also tanks, essentially, and they came in different paint schemes. Oh boy, probably can't read this either, but the importance of milk I want to show, for example, here in New England, for the Boston Main Railroad alone. Dwight Smith worked for the Boston Main for many, many years, several decades. He's retired now, lives in New Hampshire, and I think he must be about 97 today. He gave a presentation at the Rutland Railroad Historical Society Annual Convention in 2007, and that's what I've taken this data from. And what it says at the bottom is that the Boston Main in 1948 delivered 15,747 cars of milk to dairies and creameries located on the railroad. In addition, there were 1,300 cars of what was termed Western cream, which means it came from west of the Hudson River, interchange from other railroads. So all told, the number of inbound loads to Boston carried on the Boston Main for milk and cream, 17,081 cars in 1948. That's almost 50 cars per day. That's a train load of milk. That's a very significant volume of business. And this was also, I might add, very profitable business because you couldn't screw up. The milk business required not only all the inspection at the sources, farms and so on, but also if you're using ice and it's a 95-degree day, you can't have these cars sitting somewhere on a siding for very long without having unpleasant consequences. So this was high-value traffic. In 1948, 60% of the total volume of fresh milk delivered in the Boston market moved via the Boston Main and from the railroads that interchanged to the Boston Main. The railroad milk traffic was handled in the tank cars, the so-called tank cars that I showed you, with two large tanks in a single car. They were also, milk was also delivered with the can cars, and I say here, typically 150 to 240 of the 40-quart milk cans. So that works out to between 1,500 and 2,500 gallons of milk for each of the can cars. And there were also then cars that carried bottled milk and bottled cream. And these carried in wooden crates 20 quart-sized bottles. These were peculiar to a couple of operations delivered to what used to be Finast, or the First National Stores, the original name, in Boston, and also to Providence. And these came from, the bottled milk cars came from the Bellows Falls Cooperative Creamery in Bellows Falls, Vermont. And this business lasted for quite some time, into the 60s. The operation of milk cars typically was at the head end of a passenger train. And very interestingly, milk cars were not considered to be freight cars. And you did not find milk train schedules in freight train schedules. They were typically published in the employee timetables along with passenger trains. The milk cars had high-speed trucks for operation on passenger trains. They had steam heat lines, and they had air signal lines and air brake lines. So very distinctly different from freight cars. And again, this was a high-value commodity, so it was important to the railroad. And that's why you would see milk trains operating at the same speed as passenger trains on a given line. So they operated, as I say here again, at the head end along with the mail cars, express cars, RPOs, and they had the equipment specialized for passenger trains. I think it's interesting also to point out that for those railroads that operated milk trains, so complete train loads of milk cars, some railroads classified them as first class and some railroads classified them as second class. And I've just given a couple of examples. The Rutland Railroad considered a milk train to be first class. The New York Central considered it to be second class. I said I would describe the route taken for that very longest delivery to New York City. This is that route shown here in green and black. On the Rutland Railroad, cars were picked up in Ogdensburg, New York, and then on stations along this line, the former Ogdensburg and Lake Champlain, all the way to Alburgh, Vermont, on the Canadian border, pardon me. Then the train would turn south to Burlington, Vermont, to Bennington, Vermont through Rutland, then down the Chatham subdivision to Chatham, New York. Here the train was typically arriving at about 9 p.m. in the evening, at least in later years, later decades, and turned over to interchange to the New York Central, the Harlem division of the New York Central at Chatham, New York. There was then a 122-mile run to Mott Haven Yard in the Bronx, which was an enormous yard on the New York Central. And the reason I used Mott Haven as the destination here and not New York City is because cars were split out and handled. There were a number of New York Central yards along the west side of Manhattan Island, but there were also a number of milk processing plants in the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan, and also in the Bronx. So cars were then handled by local switchers to those various facilities. That total route mile, the route mile total for this run from Ogdensburg to Alburgh to New York was 462 miles. And this was done every single day of the year. This is a map from 1889 of just the New York Central's portion of that route. This is Chatham, where the interchange was made from the Rutland to the New York Central. Our house was here. So this, the milk trains went right by what was the house I grew up in, down to Mott Haven and to the city of New York. Here is how a conductor on a milk train on the Rutland knew where he was going with all the cars that he had in his train. Over here you see what's called a conductor's switch list or shifting list, and it's all handwritten because that's the way things were done. This is from 1950. This is train number 88 on the Rutland Railroad, which ran on the route that I showed you. This is one day, January 1950, and these I've transcribed here. These are all the car numbers and the car owners, the companies that own the cars. On that particular train that day, you probably can't read this, but this says either L for load or E for empty. So all of these cars are the loaded milk cars coming down the Rutland to be handed over to the New York Central. And these are the destinations: 57th Street Yard, 60th Street Yard, 130th Street Yard in Manhattan. Melrose Junction was in the Bronx. Bronx Terminal Market was in the Bronx. And the conductor has also laid out way over here, he's written in what are called blocks. So he's identified how these cars are going to be organized and how they're going to be dropped, which block gets dropped first, second, third, etc. But then he also had some freight cars in the consist. Some of them were to go to the Boston and Albany. Some of them were to go down the Hudson Division. In this case, Port Ivory was the destination on Staten Island for this particular Gaddix tank car. And in place of a caboose, the Rutland tended to use a combine, which was a passenger car. Number 260 was always the car used on this particular run. That ran every night. It was known as the Rutland Milk or the Rut Milk. Here's a photograph from the New York Central System Historical Society's collection This is the Rutland milk train. These are the empties in the morning being returned north, because if you think about it, the loads of milk, fresh milk, every night are delivered to the New York Central by about 9 o'clock in Chatham, and then delivered in the early morning hours to the various facilities in New York City. But those are all the loads coming inbound. The next morning, all the empty cars had to be shipped back to the various stations where they had been picked up. It was quite a complex operation. And every one of those milk cans, the 240 milk cans carried in each milk car, they had to all get back to their owners. Okay. Oh, you won't be able to read this either. I need to remember this. This is from one employee timetable. This is just one page of one employee timetable from 1907 on the New York Central, and it lists all of the passenger trains operating westbound on the Harlem division, but it also shows, here's train 75 departing Mott Haven Junction, arriving in Chatham at 12 p.m., and that's the milk train 6 days a week, considered to be second class. Then there is also train number 90, come on, fella. Train number 93 from Mount Vernon, also Mott Haven, back to Chatham. That's the Sunday only operation of the milk train. So 7 days a week, you had at least one inbound and one outbound, one all loads, one all empties. There were years on the New York Central when there were 2 such milk trains operated per day, and therefore 2 empty trains also. This is a Howard Fogg painting. He's a well-known railroad artist. There's been a lot of speculation as to what the location is meant to be, and oftentimes people will say, railroad buffs will say, oh, that's on the Harlem division, it has to be, or that's on the North Adams branch, it has to be, or it's on the Boston Albany, it has to be. We actually don't know, but it's a really nice watercolor by Howard Fogg, and that's a milk train. Other examples of milk train operations, and these were operations that occurred across the country. This is the Eastern Railroad, which eventually was acquired by the Boston, Maine, and this details from Bethlehem, New Hampshire, way up here, Bethlehem, New Hampshire, down to North Conway, down the Conway branch to Dover, and then into Boston. So this line is gone now. This ran through Salisbury and Newburyport up to Portsmouth. That's all torn out. That's now becoming a rail trail. But this line is still in operation. And up here you have the Conway Scenic Railroad, which was founded by Dwight Smith. So here's another example of the number of miles, 160 miles from Bethlehem, New Hampshire to North Station that milk trains and milk cars were traversing every day. Here's an example of a schedule, passenger schedule from 1882 from the Eastern. Examples of points where the Boston and Maine now was loading milk. This is 1948. On the Boston, Maine, which had quite a milk operation, they were receiving cars in Woodsville, New Hampshire from 4 other railroads, the Canadian Pacific, St. Johnsbury and Lamoille County, the Barrie and Chelsea, the Boston, Maine itself. There were 12 cars handled. This is 1948 as an average. From White River Junction, 2 railroads, 3,700 carloads. Portland, Maine, 3 railroads, 3,400 carloads. Bellows Falls, 3 railroads, 2,800 carloads. Eagle Bridge, New York, from the Delaware and Hudson, 1,700 carloads. And that's where that total of 15,700 cars handled on the Boston, Maine, delivered to Boston. Those are the origin points for those cars. And this is again from Dwight Smith's presentation. This is taken from a Boston and Maine 1954 freight train schedule, and the freight train schedules were quite detailed, and they highlighted exactly what types of traffic was going to be handled in each train. Just some examples here. Freight BU1 was scheduled to depart from Boston at 6:45 in the evening. It was a daily freight train, and it would carry, in terms of milk products, it would carry empty Enfield milk cars for Enfield, Connecticut, Central Vermont milk cars, Canadian Pacific milk cars. What was called the Camel was another operating, sorry. Doesn't want to go where I want to point it. What was called the Camel left at 6:50 in the morning. That was also a daily freight train, and that carried milk cars for Lynn and Portsmouth and so on. Very detailed schedules. The New Haven Railroad had similar, very detailed routing for milk cars and milk traffic. Much of the New Haven's traffic came into H.P. Hood in Boston, and the H.P. Hood traffic continued for quite a long time, well into the 1950s. And in fact, the Boston Maine had also purchased new steel milk cars in I believe it was 58, very late. And that was for the Bellows Falls Cooperative Creamery business coming out of Bellows Falls. Those cars did not operate for very long in milk train service. 1952, the first certification of a bulk tank truck for milk haulage. 1958, a federal milk order from the Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, made a major change in how milk from Western Vermont was handled, moving it from the New York market to the Boston Milk District. That had a very significant impact on the railroads that handled that milk. 1967, all creameries had stopped accepting can cars, that is, no more 40-quart milk cans, and all of that was to go by truck. And in 1972, the trucks had won. The last railroad-hauled milk traffic was delivered by the Boston Maine in Boston. So that documents the end of milk traffic on the railroads. Just some more photographs. This is milk cans being loaded on a truck in Hardwick, Vermont. This truck is going to carry the milk cans over to the station for the St. Johnsbury and Lamoille County. This is an example of a small town in Vermont, Rupert, Vermont, on the very edge of the Vermont-New York border. And this is the creamery here. This is the ice house for the creamery. This is the elevator for the ice house. This is the freight station and the and the passenger station in this small town of Rupert, Vermont. This is on the Delaware and Hudson Railway. And this is where milk comes from. There are some exceptional modelers in the world, railroad modelers in the world. This is Randy Laframboise in Vermont, and this is his layout. This shows Rutland milk train number 80, south of Florence, Vermont. This is a photograph of an outbound milk train on the Harlem Division. This is North White Plains, New York, and that's all the empties being returned back to the north. This is a good photo to show how important this milk traffic was. Thank you. This is also on the Harlem Division. This is the westbound so-called Rutland milk. And you can, well, perhaps you can't see easily, but there are 4 freight cars here, and then the rest of the train is milk cars. We always need to remember that there are a lot of employees involved in operation of railroads. That's still true even today, even though the numbers are much smaller. This is a photograph I particularly like from my own negative collection. This was taken by a man named Thomas Hurricane. He's long ago passed away, but I don't know the name of the engineer, a young engineer at North White Plains, New York, in the cab of a New York Central locomotive. Very nice photograph. This is a photograph by John Krause, a well-known railroad photographer. This is, I'm pretty sure this is close to Proctor, Vermont, and I'm guessing the date is about 1948. This is Rutland Train 71, and We have one freight car, but then everything else in sight is a milk car. These are the empties returning north in Vermont. Some more recent examples. This is early 1950s. This is the Rutland Railroad, and again, milk cars in sight here. This is the Rutland in Bellows Falls, and the first car on the head pin is a milk car here also. That's an MDT milk reefer coming into Bellows Falls. And we're at the end. This is Stephentown, New York. This is on what was the Rutland's Chatham subdivision. This is the route by which I documented here to show you the 467-mile route. This is one of the small stations in a small town, Stephentown, New York, very close to the Vermont border in New York State. The station is obviously here. This is gone now. It was torn down in 2014, I believe. This is the Creamery building. The Creamery building is, I believe, still standing. And this is the right-of-way for the Rutland Railroad's Chatham subdivision. This was abandoned in May of 1953 and completely torn out by July of 1953. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you. I would also like to say I'm the editor for the Rutland Railroad Historical Society magazine. This is our quarterly magazine. I'm a really bad guy because I'm a year behind. Everybody thinks I'm retired, and I'm not. This is a labor of love, but it is a great deal of, I get a lot of enjoyment out of producing, laying out the magazine. We do this once a quarter. Our membership is $20 a year, which I think is very reasonable for membership. I'd also like to make a point about the Boston Maine Railroad Historical Society, another very good organization, I think about 1,400 members today. And of course, this is all Boston, Maine territory that we're in today. Thank you very much. Thank you. Wow, I finished early. That can't be.
Oh, there's going to be questions.
I can't possibly finish early. That's never happened. Any questions?
So these farmers would bid on the right to sell the milk, or the trains would stop every 5 miles in a new town and pick up milk from a farmer who had 40 cows and then stop someplace else and pick up milk from somebody who had 250 cows?
The intricacies of exactly how this happened and how everything, of course, was written out by hand. So I've shown you just a couple of documents, examples of documents used. There were many more such documents. So the farmer would drop off his cans of milk at the station closest to him. And again, that probably was not more than 2 miles away. The invoicing, how he was billed for the cost of transportation, that I don't know. But every station, every town had a station, every station had an agent, and these were amongst the agent's duties at the time. All those things, of course, have disappeared today. No such thing. We have what we call stations, but not staffed. Bob?
Hi, Dave. Two interesting points that you made, and pretty much not clear to a lot of people. Number one, what's a combine? And number two, you referred to engines as 442s. What does that mean?
440, yeah. Combine is a combination car. Combine just being a short term, meaning it had a passenger section and it had a baggage section. And a 440 is the White system of steam locomotive classification. 4 wheels in the pony truck and 4 driving wheels. So 2 axles and 4 wheels that were doing the actual driving, transmitting power to the rails. A 440 is one example of that classification system. And there are many, many different types of steam locomotives. And diesel locomotives, diesel electric locomotives have a similar classification system also. Thanks, Bob.
On behalf of the
I got stuck last year
civilians,
because I
thank
used
you.
the term RPO and I didn't explain what an RPO was. So I'll say before anybody asks, an RPO is a railway post office. It's how your mail used to get delivered.
As pertains to milk trains, what was the difference between first class and second class? Did the second class people get shunted off or what?
Well, I was using a comparison between the Rutland and the New York Central. The Rutland considered a milk train to be a first-class schedule. The New York Central considered it to be a second-class schedule. Generally speaking, this has more to do with who has priority. On a railroad, safety is everything, and that is still absolutely the case today. Absolutely the case today. So a first-class train on the Rutland had priority over everything else, unless an agent in a station had received via the telegraph orders from the dispatcher, and then he wrote out a set of orders for the locomotive engineer. There was what was called a train order board outside the station. He would move that to stop, and he would go out on the station platform to hand up the new orders to the engineer. That was done whenever there was some reason for a change. No matter what, if there was a tree down across the railroad, or if there was something more serious, if there had been a derailment, et cetera. But first class, second class, third class, all refers to which train has priority. And it's a very serious and consequential issue. Sure, great question. And I hope I've gotten most of that right.
A two-part question, if I might. Do you know if there are any ice houses on ponds still existing in this area? And the second part is about the milk cars, whether you're aware of any that have been preserved or repurposed, like what happened to them?
Oh, I mentioned that the Boston, Maine had new milk cars, steel milk cars, tank cars built and delivered. Bob, am I right, 1958? Yeah, late 58, I believe. They were only in service for a couple of years. And I know two of them sat along the railroad in Gardner, Massachusetts for decades. They were still there, I think, even maybe into the 1990s. My guess is there are preserved milk cars somewhere. I would certainly think that Steamtown, for example, Scranton, Pennsylvania, there's probably at least one wooden milk car, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's a steel milk car too. Anybody else know a better answer?
Well, upstate New Hampshire? Okay.
Ice harvesting. Bruce is my neighbor. He's here from Amesbury, and Bruce runs an organization called Lake Gardner Improvement Association. And one of the things we've talked about is the fact that on Lake Gardner, right across the street from our houses, there were ice houses, commercial ice houses. These were all over the, at least northern states, wherever ice would form that was thick enough to actually get out on and harvest. Many times these buildings still stood for years and decades after their original use had passed. I wouldn't be surprised if there aren't still some ice houses around somewhere.
If I might, there's a museum in Tamworth that was a doctor's house, which he gave to the town or whatever. And they have a little pond there, and every year they harvest ice. The children come with their oxen and their little skids, and they take the ice to the ice house, little ice house, and just, it's all packed in sawdust. It's amazing what keeps it.
Really?
Because in the days, oh yeah, you just thrown in there. We used to get ice from in Hillsborough in the girls' camp.
And they're still doing this?
And well, they're still doing it in Tamworth, yes, every winter when it's harvest ice.
Good. Could everybody hear that? That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, what's it called? That museum. Oh, I was hoping you looked like you knew. Exeter issue, okay. We had ice houses in Exeter, but not huge. Yeah.
So I have a question. Does anybody know was there one or more creameries in Exeter? I could not find any.
We had
evidence.
two in Exeter. Laurel Farms out on Pickpocket Road, actually in Brentwood, And there used to be one on Washington Street here in Exeter, and that was Fremont Dairy.
That was Fremont?
Yeah, Fremont Dairy.
Yeah.
And talking about ice houses, Calkins Pond was used as an ice house. I mean, that they cut the ice, and it was stored in a ice house, which was near the opposite side of Calkins Pond. And the Iceman went around Exeter selling ice.
Yeah. To the steel box outside that's a now today cubed ice, not too many uses for block ice. In Salisbury, on the way down the bridge road into Newburyport, there used to be an ice company. It may still be there. A few years ago it was still there. At least the building still had the name of the ice company, and there were trucks there. Commercial ice storage and delivery is still done. The point of what I was trying to describe in this presentation was not just to show photographs of railroad trains, much as I like to do that. I wanted to show the story that the railroads were part of in alleviating a major health challenge in U.S. cities. And it was the development of ice harvesting as a commercial business, the development then of ice houses for storage, the ice delivery in cities, the development of things like pasteurization to get us away from what had been called swill milk. Oh, nobody asked, swill milk. It's meant to be a really ugly term because it was really ugly milk. And it was loaded with bacteria. It also had plaster of Paris in it and other things, and it had a very blue color. It was a really poor excuse for milk, and that's what was fed to so many young infants in, for example, the city of New York, which is what led to the infamous swill milk scandal, which then put pressure on government. Nobody also asked, why was John D. Rockefeller interested in pursuing pasteurization? He's the oil man. He's the founder of Standard Oil. Why did he care about milk? He was an investor in Borden's. He was an investor in Sheffield Farms. It made sense. It was good business to have high-quality milk available in volume in the cities where he was doing business.
I was wondering if your research showed you how those mortality figures, the childhood mortality figures, might have changed when better milk became more readily available.
Yeah, gee, I must have skipped over something because in here I did have a statement. So I said it was 1 in 2. By 1900, it was only 1 in 5. Wow. It didn't make it to their first birthday. So there was a very significant improvement. That's off the cuff, but I'm recalling what I put in the slide. It's interesting to see that Columbia University had so much information available, and they actually had a public display in New York regarding the milk business, the development of the milk business, and I'm believing that that's because they acquired a former Sheffield Farms property and converted it to a new science center for the university. Very interesting connection, though, between the university and the city. And it was a Columbia University professor who had started the first, chemistry professor, who had started the first investigation of where is all this infection coming from? What is the source for why are these babies dying? And that was, what did I say, 1860? That was the beginnings of such investigation, which ultimately led to pasteurization and so on. Yes?
Yeah, Dave, two
Bill?
questions.
Hi,
Yes.
Bill.
Hi. Number one, did they also deliver cheese?
Oh,
Or
yeah.
other milk products?
Milk, cheese, butter, you name it. Yep. Ice cream? Not really.
That's too bad. And secondly, were the milk cans returned clean?
I had to drop things out just in order to stay within an hour. This whole process involved such things as, yes, washing and cleaning, because the alternative was the farmer got pretty stinking, smelly milk cans back, and that wasn't going to be very workable, because that's a primary cause of infection, of bacteria. So there are sub-industries that developed, as always happens. So milk bottling equipment, automated milk bottling equipment, automated milk bottle capping equipment, washing and cleaning, many different types of equipment, because the milk processing plants didn't just process the milk or the cheese or whatever it may be, but they also had to do the washing and cleaning of bottles and cans. Good, great question. Yep.
I've got an online comment that I think goes back a few comments in here. Muster Field Farm, Sutton, New Hampshire, cuts ice on Keezer Lake each January in stores and ice houses for use in the summer, making ice cream at their museum. So.
Interesting. All right. Great. Great. Anybody know of a milk car that's still existing somewhere? Somebody's got to know. And there have to be some. I mean, everything's been saved. And by the way, John, as I was saying earlier, if you think this sounds a little nutty, try going to the UK. The British are absolutely bonkers. I was at a so-called heritage railway a number of years ago. It's a restored operation run by volunteers, steam locomotives, diesel locomotives. They've built stations, they've built track, all volunteers. And I was talking to an older couple in the parking lot one night on a Saturday night, and it was a big day and we were all exhausted, but I talked to these folks for probably an hour, hour and a half, and finally the husband looked at me and said, "Dave, don't you understand? We British, we like anything old." What prompted that was, do you know what a steam tractor is? All the cars, this was a big day, it was their bank holiday weekend in May. Thousands of people had come to this little steam preservation railway. They were all gone, it was late, it was getting close to 9 o'clock, 8:30, 9 o'clock. All the cars are gone, but there were two steam tractors, these enormous old farm tractors that ran on steam. This is what farmers were doing before diesel engines and gasoline engines. And while I was talking to this couple, two young guys come sauntering down through the parking lot, and the husband I'm talking to said, "Oh yeah, they're probably getting on those steam tractors." Yep, that's exactly what happened. And then he said, "They're probably going to the pub." And all I could think of is, man alive, on these little narrow British roads, one of these big, huge things and the guy's going to the pub. Well, we finally stopped talking, we got in our cars and left, and I knew there was a pub right down at the little roundabout, walking distance away, and lo and behold, there were the two steam tractors in the parking lot for the pub. Woo!
Okay.
We British, we like anything old. That was a classic. Thanks, everybody.
I have another question. I assume mothers nursed their babies for the first year. How did these babies get sick? Was it really the swill milk?
Well, not every mother nurses a baby, right? I'm no expert, and I've never had children, but okay. I mean, it's not exactly something that's free of pain, correct? It's not something you want to continue for very long, right?
I thought it was through age 5.
Say what?
I thought the slide said through age 5.
Oh, yeah.
The slide did say through age 5, so, yeah.
Yeah, the early slide, yep, right. Yeah, it wasn't just absolute infants. It was all young children that were at risk, absolutely.
Microphone.
Breaking the cardinal rule. If I'm not mistaken, though, and there are probably folks in the room who know more about this than I do, among the upper class of the Victorian ages, it was considered extremely gauche to nurse your children, right? So they had what was called a wet nurse, yes?
Yes, good point, good point.
Yeah, plus there's a high maternal mortality rate, so there's women who were no longer in existence. There were mothers who hired wet nurses. There were mothers who didn't have enough milk supply. There's a lot of reasons why, it's a challenge today. It was a challenge back then. So It was always a rough.
I'm going to stay away from that question.
Yeah, we'll leave that one alone. It's a public health issue.
I have no ability to answer anything on that subject. That's it. We're done.
All right. Thank you for being our
Thank you,
speaker
everyone.
tonight.
Thanks a
Thank you
lot.
all for coming out. And we'll see you next month on the 4th, February 4th.